situated here. Take my travel pack off, my fanny pack. Alright, let's get into it. Hydration. Let's see. Yeah, that's better. All right. Here we go. What's going on, beautiful people? What's going on? Great day, great day, great day to you. We are continuing, or I guess I should do like, welcome to Reading with Jam. Thank you again for those who have checked out this streaming thing that I'm doing. This practicing in public that I am calling Reading with Jam, where as a voice actor, I am practicing my voiceover skills and abilities in my reading and audiobook narration, or just narration in general, by reading nonfiction and self-help books that I was already going to read anyway. This is stuff that's already in my daily practice of self-enrichment and self-development. And I figured I'd practice in public and try to share some good and helpful content with you as well. And so we've been reading Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins. And so I think this might be, I don't know which part it is. I put part 6, but I'm probably wrong. But anyways, yeah. So we're going to continue to read Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins. And today we will be reading chapter 6. Chapter 6. Here, let me get situated real quick. Yesterday we were at chapter 5, and in chapter 5 it talked about, or chapter 5 was entitled Cultivate Patrons, and just talked about the importance of, as an artist and as a creative, how you need patrons, people to support your art and to make space for you to be creative. And that can come in many forms. It can come in the form of actual people who are like, hey, I want to support you, give you money. It can come in the form of a day job. I think it can also come in the form of various clients that you have over and over and over again. But it's necessary for any creative to have the space to do their creative and artistic work. They need money. They need resources. They need that time and space to actually create. So that's why it's important. If you're trying to become a thriving artist, you need to cultivate having patrons. But we are moving on. That was chapter 5. So if you want to go back and listen to that, you can find that on my page. I'm also uploading these videos, these lives, on my YouTube channel, which is Jamiel Cal-Pin VO. And so I have other stuff there, other content that I've done. Anything that you're interested in, you can go check it out at Jamiel Cal-Pin VO. Just search for it on YouTube. But yes, today we are reading chapter 6 of Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins. Let's get into it. Chapter 6. Go join a scene. The starving artist believes he can be creative anywhere. The thriving artist goes where creative work is already happening. If you want to be creative, go where your questions lead you. Louis Leon Moore. When a young paramedic returned home after serving with the Red Cross in World War I, he had little idea where life would take him next. At 19 years old, recuperating from the wounds of a mortar blast and a broken heart, his prospects were limited. On the Italian front, he had fallen in love with a nurse who had stopped answering his letters and run off with another man. Soon these experiences would serve as the foundation for a narrative that would transform him into one of the world's most famous authors. But at the moment, Ernest Hemingway was just another directionless kid. It didn't take long to realize Oak Park, Illinois, was not where Hemingway wanted to be. At the suggestion of a friend, he took a job at the Toronto Star, working as a journalist. A year later, he moved back to Chicago, where he fell in love with a young woman named Hadley Richardson. The two married and began making plans to relocate to Europe. Around that time, Hemingway met novelist Sherwood Anderson, who told him to move to Paris because it was where the most interesting people in the world lived. In Paris, Hemingway could work on his writing with his foreign correspondence work paying the bills. The couple could live modestly and still be able to travel. For a young, restless couple, it sounded like a dream. Not long after their wedding, the young writer and his new wife packed up their belongings, boarded a ship, and made their way to a new life. When the young couple arrived in the Latin Quarter, the Hemingways found a small community of intellectuals and expatriates who were not unlike themselves. Through letters of introduction from Sherwood Anderson, they met many soon-to-be famous authors and artists who would become some of their closest friends. Living on the left bank, Hemingway met the influences who would shape his work and transform him into Papa, the larger-than-life figure who would go on to define the literary style of a generation. But at the time, these acquaintances were simply their neighbors, fellow creatives trying to hack it out like everyone else. Every morning, the young author would walk along the Seine River, watching the fishermen pull their catch out of the water, a reminder of childhood summers spent on Lake Michigan. Often, he would stop at a cafe for a few hours and write, fictionalizing his youth while sipping a cafe cream or a demi blonde. Everything he experienced became a part of him and his stories. In his spare time, Hemingway would exchange boxing lessons for writing tips with Ezra Pound. At the Closerie de Lilas, or Les Deux Magots, he sometimes spotted James Joyce, or bumped into F. Scott Fitzgerald, who introduced him to editor Maxwell Perkins. In the evenings, he would stroll down to 27 Rue de Flore, where Gertrude Stein lived, and listen to her lecture on the importance of buying paintings rather than clothes. It all happened in Paris. Hemingway spent the greater part of his 20s living in that community, what came to be called the Lost Generation, living on little, surrounded by brilliance. Life in that little Parisian neighborhood provided an invaluable education for an up-and-coming writer in the 1920s, and he used it all to fuel his writing. Later, he translated his experiences into The Sun Also Rises, a semi-autobiographical novel that would earn him widespread fame. Before his time there, the young writer was certainly skilled, but by no means famous. But when he returned to America 7 years later, Ernest Hemingway had become a household name. Considering all the people he met during his time there, it's hard to imagine such a transformation taking place had Hemingway not heeded Sherwood Anderson's advice. What was it about his time in Paris that made such a difference? Maybe it wasn't the time, but the place. The rule of the scene. One day, college professor Richard Florida was walking across the campus of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when he saw a table surrounded by people. Several were wearing blue t-shirts with the name of an Austin-based software company. He asked if they were recruiting students. No, absolutely not, they said. They had come to hang out for the day, all the way from Austin. What a strange thing to do, Professor Florida thought. Later in the day, he heard that a student who had been a part of the crowd had just signed a contract with the company. It was the highest paying deal any graduating student in the history of his department had ever received. When Florida asked the student, covered in tattoos and piercings, why he was going to a smaller city in the middle of Texas, a place that lacked many of the cultural amenities of Pittsburgh, the young man replied, "It's in Austin." It was the city that ultimately clinched the deal for him. What attracted the student to Austin was not a century's worth of industry, as Pittsburgh could boast, but a thriving music scene, cultural diversity, and a bustling nightlife. Despite offers from other tech firms in larger cities, the young man decided on a city known for its progressive politics and eclectic culture because he believed that was where he'd do his best work. This student is part of what Richard Florida calls the creative class, a growing group of professionals that are quickly becoming an important part of society. This growing group of creative workers now makes up a third of the labor force, working in a wide range of industries from technology to entertainment, journalism to finance, and manufacturing to the arts. And one of the most important issues for a member of the creative class is location. Some places have an it factor. We see this in architectural beautiful cities like Rome or Paris, which are full of amazing art and well-designed buildings. Other places serve as hotbeds for certain industries, such as the personal computer revolution launched in Silicon Valley. We intuitively grasp that certain locations are more attractive than others. This, of course, applies to creative work. This, of course, applies to creative work as well, maybe even especially. The most important factor in the success of your career, Richard Florida told me, is where you decide to live. This is the rule of the scene, which says that places and people shape the success of our work far more than we realize. Location is not irrelevant. Place matters. As social psychologist Mihaly, man, these names. As social psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi wrote, creativity is more likely in places where new ideas require less effort to be perceived. The starving artist thinks she can do her work anywhere, but the thriving artist understands that where we live and do our work affects the work itself. As artists, we want to be where we feel understood. We want to live in places where our work and way of life are encouraged. When musician and author Patti Smith was asked why New York was an attractive place for creatives in the 1970s, she said, "It was cheap to live here, really cheap. There were so many of us, so many like minds. We go where there are others like us, and these scenes can help our work thrive." Such hotspots of creativity, when properly harnessed, can become powerful spurs to creative work. In the early 20th century, Paris was such a scene. It was inexpensive, tolerant toward unconventional lifestyles, and attractive to artists. So it is 1921. Okay. It is 1921. What does a fledgling journalist who wants to be a serious writer do? He boards a ship and moves to Paris, joining that community of artists and expats living there. He embeds himself in the creative scene, befriending the leading literary minds of the time, and profits from the opportunities such a place affords. Without Paris, you do not get Hemingway, and without a scene, you do not get a creative genius. I am struggling today, sorry. Scenes beget networks. When Hank Willis Thomas enrolled in graduate school, he was trying to avoid getting a job. But when his cousin was murdered in 2000, he began using photography and visual art to process the experience. "Art was part of my mourning process," he said. His time at California College of the Arts became a kind of extended therapy, during which he threw himself into his creative work. When his studies ended in 2004, Hank thought it was time to get a real job, but in grad school he had stumbled upon a surprising lesson, which led to his eventual success as an artist. "What grad school does," he explained, "is help you build a network." As an art student, Hank had accidentally built something every artist needs, something so essential that without it, success is all but impossible. A network is more than a team of cheerleaders. It's a diverse group of individuals who offer a set of skills and resources that help each member succeed. After all, not every art student becomes an artist. Some become curators, community organizers, and patrons. Others become collectors, dealers, and auction house owners. And nearly all become entrepreneurs of some sort, buying and selling in ways that contribute to the business of art. These are the people Hank Willis Thomas met in art school, and they are the ones who later became his network. After graduation, Hank saw the careers of his friends take off and was surprised to see how those connections influenced the success of his work. He sold a piece of artwork, a black and white photograph of a group of college students holding a picture frame while others documented the event, to the son of the dean at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. That was his first sale as an artist. It happened as the result of a connection he'd made thanks to the scene he was a part of, a benefit of the network he'd grown. Word of mouth spread, and to his surprise, soon Hank Willis Thomas was selling his art for a living. Those early successes were the building blocks of a career that over the years would blossom into a full-time living, making Hank a respected artist in New York City. Today his work has been featured in galleries and projects all over the country. He has a strong social media following, influencing tens of thousands of fans every day, much of it thanks to those people he met in art school. All my great opportunities have come from friends, he said. You really only need one or two good friends, because it's really about having someone who's going to advocate for you. That's the formula for success. Thriving artists do not succeed in a vacuum. They put themselves in the right places and avail themselves of the opportunities there. They don't try to create just anywhere. That would be foolish. After all, not all places are created equal. So thriving artists go where their magic is. But this takes more than moving to a new city. You have to join a scene, wherever you find one, and that means making connections with the people who will help your work succeed. In other words, you have to build a network. Without a network, creative work does not succeed. Exposure to the right networks can accelerate your success like few things can. This flies in the face of what we typically expect an artist to do or say. All my great opportunities have come from friends, Hank said. Great work does not come about through a single stroke of genius, but by the continual effort of a community. When the right people advocate for your work, your success becomes more likely. Being good is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Skill is a prerequisite for creative success, but talent is only part of the equation. The rest is network. A network is your insurance against anonymity. The greater access you have to influential people in your field, the further your work will spread. Of course, you have to be good, but being good is not enough. Skill gets you in front of the right people, but network magnifies your reach. Creative success, then, is contingent on your ability to connect well with those who can vouch for your work. It doesn't take a lot of people, just a few friends, as Hank said. You don't need an army, but you do need a network. The exposure you gain from these relationships is invaluable. When no one is paying attention to your work, these connections can keep you from starving. No one succeeds alone, not even creative geniuses. When they reject you. During his early 20s, Vincent van Gogh moved from one job to the next, working first as an art dealer, then as a school teacher, and later as a missionary. Each transition was accompanied by a renewed but short-lived zeal. He seemed immature and reckless, and by all accounts, was. Then, at 27 years old, Van Gogh taught himself a new set of skills. First he learned to draw, and then he learned to paint. With no formal training, the young artist tackled his craft, tirelessly creating an impressive body of work in a short amount of time. Unlike his previous professions, he did not quit his career, and today his works are some of the most valuable pieces of art on the planet. When we think of Vincent van Gogh, we probably think of a lone genius, the maniac artist who cut off his ear, suffered for his art, and took his own life. The madman living in poverty and isolation. It's hard to imagine a more stereotypical picture of a starving artist. The problem, however, is this depiction is incomplete. Though Van Gogh likely had some sort of mental illness, it was not the madness that made his art succeed. It was his network. Long before the world knew his name, Vincent van Gogh had a group of people who helped him become the artist we know him as today. Like every artist, he was not immune to the need for gatekeepers to validate his work. But how could he, a penniless and failed missionary, earn his place in the art scene? When Vincent began his career as a painter, he had a vision for what he wanted to accomplish. His painting, however, was sloppy and imprecise, unpalatable to the mainstream art critics. He used too much paint and was reckless with his use of color and texture. The work was difficult to categorize. Some thought it looked like child's play. Even his own mother criticized it. Who then could vouch for him? It began with his younger brother, Theo, a successful art dealer. Through letters, Theo's words kept Vincent going when life was hard, which was often. When Vincent decided to become an artist, Theo paid his bills, gave him a place to stay, and shared his work with others. He was his brother's patron and chief promoter. Much of Van Gogh's career was filled with failure and rejection, but when he moved to Paris and met a group of painters whose work had been similarly rejected, he found his scene. These artists affirmed what Van Gogh was trying to do. In some ways, they understood it better than he did. They even had a name for it: Impressionism. The French Impressionist could challenge and guide Van Gogh in the direction he was already headed, validating his work in the process. They became the network he needed, and that changed everything. Once he became a member of their inner circle, Van Gogh gave back to that network, helping organize it into a more formal group and adopting the name, the Painters of the Petit Boulevard. Using his brother's connections, he helped display their works in galleries, and years later, when the Impressionists were recognized for their artistic genius, his work was included among theirs. The cruelty of life likely would have bankrupted Vincent van Gogh, were it not for the people who supported him. Life was not easy for him, but thanks to the support of his brother, he did not have to starve. The Impressionists encouraged and challenged him when others were prone to reject him. When he died at the young age of 37, Van Gogh had painted thousands of canvases, the equivalent of a lifetime of work for many artists. Only months after his death, his brother Theo died too, leaving his wife, Johanna, with a house full of paintings. Thanks to her husband's connections and her own network, she could sell off much of the artwork and help it get the attention it deserved. A network of people validated Van Gogh's work and championed it long after he was gone. And it is to this network, the efforts of a solitary artist that we it is to this network, not the efforts of a solitary artist, that we should be grateful. This is the way creative work spreads, not through the efforts of a lone genius, but through a network. Remember, it was not an official group of gatekeepers who validated Van Gogh's art. It was a ragtag band of misfits with one thing in common: rejection, and that can be a powerful motivator. It wasn't that the Impressionists disregarded the power of networks. That would have meant career suicide. They simply redirected their efforts to create a new network, which raises an important question. What do you do when the network you want doesn't want you? When you're playing a game, you can't seem to win. Sometimes the best thing to do is not try harder. None of us want to spend our lives playing by someone else's rules. When the game is unfair, change the game you're playing. Move to another city. Create a new art form. Get a different network. If the group you want to be a part of doesn't want you, then create your own. This is what the Impressionists did when the gatekeepers of art in the 19th century rejected them. They opened their own gallery and invited people to it. And a century later, people remembered them, not those who rejected them. And when a young misunderstood Dutchman joined that scene in Paris, he finally had a group of people who understood and validated his work. Unlikely genius clusters. The rule of the scene shows us that not all places are created equal, and when we find the right scene, a network often follows. But these scenes are all around us. For one artist, it might be New Orleans, and for others, it's New York City. When we find the right place, however, we must dive in deep and become a part of the scene. And if we miss this opportunity, we miss a lot. Often, though, these scenes are not what we expect. As travel writer Eric Weiner has explained, genius is a place, not a person. Weiner explored some of the most creative places on Earth, such as Florence, Silicon Valley, and Paris, wondering what made these places such hotbeds of creativity. One surprising discovery was that most of these were unlikely places. Nobody could have predicted their contributions to the world: the Italian Renaissance, the birth of the personal computer, or even modern art. These creations were surprises to the outside world, and that's good news for all of us because it means that what makes a place innovative and interesting is not some inherent quality. It means, maybe, that anywhere can be a genius cluster if we understand how to use our surroundings. In the mid 1970s, after traveling across the country in a van, Tracy Weasel moved to Jerome, Arizona with his girlfriend, Carol. In the spirit of experimentation and freedom that defined the decade, the couple was moving in hopes of getting away from the hustle and bustle of city life. In Jerome, Tracy made $20 a day selling macrame necklaces and bracelets with clay beads. He and Carol kept their expenses low, living humbly off the sales of their art, and slowly began to build a life for themselves. It took 7 years to build a place of his own, from money earned by selling his pottery. For at least 2 years, he set up his stand and potter's wheel on the sidewalk in front of his building site. His studio was the first new building in Jerome since the 1950s. I wanted to build my own place because I got tired of landlords, he said, so I bought my own property. When other artists began moving to Jerome due to the low cost of living, their artwork began attracting tourists. It's been 30 years since then, and thanks to the support of those tourists, Tracy has been able to make a living off his art ever since. Today you can find him in his shop, blowing glass and entertaining audiences with stories and facts about his craft. He makes normal things, a hummingbird feeder, wine glasses, whatever he thinks might sell. He does not consider his work high art by any means, but it's creative and fun, and allows him to live the kind of life he wants. To me, he told me over the phone one morning, that's the fun of it, making a good, simple product. Because of the support of a small town in Arizona, Tracy Weasel succeeded as an artist in ways that would not have been possible in other places. Most of the retail property in Jerome is owned by the Historical Society. The property never goes up for sale, so rent prices don't often rise. Compared to a place like Sedona, rent in Jerome is cheap. We make it so the artists can afford to be here. Other places don't do that, Tracy said. When he and Carol moved there, Jerome wasn't an important place where creative work was happening. If anything, the artists made it such a place. Certainly it had some advantages, but the greatest advantage was that it had been overlooked. It was a cheap place to live, which made it attractive for artists wanting to keep things simple. At the time Tracy moved there, Jerome was called At the time Tracy moved there, Jerome was also economically stagnant. The town was basically dead, he recalled, until the hippies came in and brought this town back to life. This is not uncommon. Artists often move into rundown parts of towns and transform those areas into popular cultural scenes. As Richard Florida wrote, the key to economic growth lies not just in the ability to attract the creative class, but to translate that underlying advantage into creative economic outcomes. The town itself was not what made Jerome special as much as the artists who came and made their homes there. But even that was not enough. Artists saw possibilities in what was an otherwise stagnant place and turned it into a hotspot. The creative class came in and made the town their own, and when they did that, the economy started to bounce back. The lesson is that when we find ourselves on the outskirts of a community we long to be part of, we have options. Like Tracy Weasel did, we can create the places we need for our work to thrive. So, when we think about where the next genius cluster will happen, we may want to look first at the unlikely places in our lives and make the most of the opportunities there. Embrace your place. Not everyone can set sail for another continent or drive across the country on a whim. Most of us have bills to pay and commitments to keep. But does this mean we are unable to do interesting creative work? Sometimes the scenes we need to be a part of are where we find ourselves right now. Because for every Hemingway in Paris, there's a Bront in Haworth. There's a Bront in Haworth. These names killing me. In the mid-19th century, Haworth was a small town in northern England, described by one writer as a dirty village of weavers' cottages, where death came early. It was a bleak place with few trees and constant wind, and a family named Bront called it home. Patrick Bronte, I think that's it, Patrick Bronte was an ambitious young minister from Ireland who had brought his family to Haworth to open a local parish. It was a hard life. There were 6 children, 5 girls, Maria, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, and a boy named Branwell. Their mother died in 1821 when their children were all under 7 years old. In 1824, the girls went to school, which was a horrific, abusive experience. The eldest, Maria, was sent home at 11 years old with tuberculosis and died. The same fate visited Elizabeth in June of that year. Patrick Bronte removed his 3 remaining daughters from school and brought them back home, where they continued their educations along with their brother, who was already home. With their father as teacher, they memorized Bible passages and studied grammar, geography, and history. Reverend Bronte read his children classic works such as Shakespeare's plays and Milton's Paradise Lost, and the 4 pupils soaked in every word. The shelves were filled with romantic literature and poetry. One night, when returning home from a trip, the Reverend brought home a set of toy soldiers for his children. The 4 siblings invented imaginary kingdoms, using the small figures to act out plays in this made-up world. They drew maps to these fantasy lands and wrote stories, poems, histories to go along with them. Storytelling was their way of coping with an otherwise harsh world, and it bound them together. As the Bronte children grew, their lives were even more centered in Haworth. The girls pursued short-lived careers as teachers and governesses, but always ended up back home. One day in 1845, Charlotte found a hidden notebook of poems by Emily. She flipped through the book and found verses with a surprising level of skill that stirred my heart like the sound of a trumpet. Shortly after, Anne came forward with poetry she had written too. It wasn't long before all 3 sisters conspired to submit a book of poems for publication under male pseudonyms. The book of poems was published in May 1846, but sold only 2 copies. Still, they wondered, could they make enough money from writing to live? Since poetry apparently was not the means to literary fame and fortune, the Bronte sisters turned to writing novels. 2 months after publishing their book of poems, the 3 sisters each submitted a novel. The 2 from Anne and Emily were accepted, but Charlotte's was turned down 7 times. On the 7th attempt, the publisher asked if she had anything else. She did have something, a story about a simple English woman not unlike herself, Jane Eyre. The other 2 books, which Anne and Emily paid to publish, were Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights. All 3 became literary classics. The Brontes did not have to move to another city to find their success. If anything, they did the exact opposite of Hemingway. But creative breakthroughs don't just happen. You must seek them out, surrounding yourself with the right network to help your work spread. So what connections did Charlotte, Emily, and Anne have while living in rural England? Certainly not the host of influential artists Hemingway was privy to in Paris. They seemed to possess no scene, no network, no special opportunity, and still their work endures today. Where then did the Brontes come from? They came from Haworth, a town so small they were forced to cling to each other, every day sharing stories with one another. When the eldest surviving Bronte sister, Charlotte, was young, she would write tiny books in a barely legible script that she bound with a small needle and thread, some of which were 60,000 words long. Like Tracy Weasel and his band of artists, the Brontes had each other, and what opportunity they lacked, they created. It was a self-made genius cluster, and they didn't have to go anywhere to build it. For years, I longed to be a writer, but felt frustrated by my lack of opportunity. Then something changed. I started to embrace my place. Instead of waiting for someone to invite me to something, I began showing up where creative work was already happening. Having moved to Nashville to chase the girl, I noticed how many authors, creatives, and entrepreneurs were emerging from this small but growing city. I started showing up in coffee shops where I knew other writers spent their time. I attended local meetups where entrepreneurs and creatives were gathering. The more I engaged with that scene, the more I became part of it, and that soon resulted in friendships that over time grew into a network. Sometimes the community we need is right in front of us. A movable feast. Ernest Hemingway once described Paris as a movable feast, meaning it could be anywhere if you knew how to take it with you. Historically, creative work has been contingent on where you lived, but in the new Renaissance, all that is changing. Sometimes we don't need to leave home. The place where our greatest growth happens is often where we find ourselves right now. But that doesn't mean we succeed by standing still. The genius cluster doesn't just happen. We must create it, cultivate it. Scenes and networks are all around us, but they will not come find us. We must move. Whether that means moving across the room or around the globe, a willingness to step out of our comfort zone is the first step toward finding the place and the people who will help our work thrive. To begin, put yourself in the places where creativity is already happening. Show up and be seen. Go to a coffee shop or a conference, or maybe make the move to a new city altogether. Join the scene and find that group of people you need to succeed. Just as Hemingway sought out key influencers in Paris, you can seek the influencers and gatekeepers in your own industry. Impress them, become their apprentices, and let them teach you. Win them over, and these people will welcome you into their scene. These connections do not just happen, though. You must earn the attention of those already established in the scene. How do you do this? Serve them somehow. Use your gifts and talents to help others succeed. This is not sucking up. It's paying your dues and proving your worth. Ernest Hemingway did not just hunt down the most famous authors of his time and pick their brains. He became their friend, offering his services in any way he could, from editing a literary magazine for Ford Madox Ford to helping Gertrude Stein get published. Vincent van Gogh displayed a similar level of servitude to his peers, as did Tracy Weasel. Success in any creative field is contingent on the scenes and networks you are a part of. You join the scene, showing up and sharing. You join the scene, showing up and sharing your work. But you build a network by giving more than you take. A network is not made by just connecting with right people, but by connecting those people to each other. It's not just who you know, it's who you help. As you make these contributions, what you will create is a group of relationships, a network that you can take with you wherever you go, just as Hemingway did with Paris. That concludes Chapter 6 of Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins. That was kind of a long chapter, but the thing is, when you are doing like voiceover, particularly if you're trying to do long form voiceover, like audiobooks or e-learning, but mainly like audiobook kind of stuff, you gotta develop your endurance when it comes to doing that kind of work. Because even if it's fiction or nonfiction, if you're reading books that are 100,000 words, it's going to take you a while to finish that book. But you may have a deadline, and so you gotta maybe crank out 10,000 words a day or every other day or something like that, so that you can ultimately complete your goal. And so there was advice I heard given by an audiobook author. I can't remember his name at this moment, but what he challenged people who are interested in doing audiobooks and also interested in voiceover is that what you should do is find a book, any book. Maybe it's a book that you like, but get that book and then find a corner in your home or your office or whatever, and then set your chair or your stool or whatever you want to sit in and face the corner, and then read that book word for word out loud for about 2 hours a day, maybe just an hour a day, and do that for 2 weeks and see by the end of those 2 weeks if you still want to be an audiobook narrator. On the surface, that may seem like, oh, that's not the big of a deal. Like, I'm just reading. That's really all I'm doing, is I'm just reading whatever is on the page or whatever in the book. But the thing is, reading out loud and reading out loud to be heard and to communicate ideas or to create characters, to evoke emotion, to try to get a message or an idea across. And sitting there and reading word for word. And again, if you're reading audiobooks for a client, you can't skip words. You can't summarize it. You have to read what the author wants you to read. So sitting there and reading that for an hour or 2 hours a day can be draining. It can be taxing. Not only on your vocal cords and like your mouth and your delivery and stuff, but on your body. You'll start to feel it in your shoulders and in your back. Even if you're sitting in the most comfortable chair, you'll start to feel it. But I guess for me, like, I've done a lot of various different types of voiceover work, and there's still a lot of voiceover work that I want to do. I still want to do more character work, like being in cartoons or audio dramas and stuff like that. And I'm grateful I have had the opportunity to be able to do some stuff like that. But I would like to do more voice acting and stuff like that, character acting. But from the stuff that I've done, audiobooks and long form narration can be some of the most challenging. Like I've done commercials. Like I said, I've done e-learning. I've done promos. I have done some character stuff. But so far, my bread and butter is like long form stuff, like e-learning, corporate narrations, like trainings and stuff like that, and audiobooks. So that's why I want to get better at it. And I also like the concept of being able to make information more accessible to people, particularly for Black people, if I'm being honest. Sometimes people don't make the time in our community to sit down and read books, but they might listen to podcasts. They might listen to an audiobook. They might watch a YouTube video, So why not take helpful information? Why not make it more accessible to our people and to our community so that we can continue to learn and grow and develop? And it doesn't have to be limited by the format of what that information is in. Because, reading is probably one of the greatest skills, or literacy in general is probably one of the most powerful tools that you can have. But not many people have access to it. But if you have access to the internet and you can listen to somebody, why not learn? Why not get that information? And I would like to help with that. I would like to help transfer that information and make that information available for people to benefit and change our community. And I know podcasting and audiobooks and voiceover, that's just one avenue. And content creation in general is just one avenue on one medium type to help make that happen. But I need to get better at it. So I have to keep practicing. So thank you all who tuned in and checked in with Reading with Jam as we're reading Real Artists Don't Starve by Jeff Goins. I will be back sometime tomorrow. And I think we're on chapter 7 now. Yep, chapter 7. So I think we're about halfway through the book. So we're making our way. But I will be back, whether it's tomorrow or the day after. I will be back with another episode of Reading with Jam, and we will continue to make our way through Real Artists Don't Starve. I'll have to figure out what I'm going to read after that, but we'll just keep focused on these chapters. But thank you for tuning in. Hope you all have a great night. Be safe. Peace.